the table of contents for the course reader mentions 2 items. One of them is a chapter from a principles textbook presenting the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, principles textbook by Cowan and Tabarak. I'm going to send that to you in the form of 2 PDFs, one for the chapter and one for the chapter appendix. And then there's a very short article by David Henderson, and the URL is in the table of contents, so you should be able to find it there. I also want to alert you to a notational idiosyncrasy or anomaly in Snowden and Bain. Y dot, in most cases, is looking at the absolute change of y, or if you think of it in terms of derivatives, it's dy dt. And actually, that is the way Snowden and Bain used the notation in the chapter you just read. So they used it in the standard way. That chapter was added. This is really a follow-on addition to a previous book, which had much of the same material, except it didn't have a chapter on economic growth. And for some reason, in the remainder of the book, when you see y dot, it will actually be referring to what in this chapter they said y dot over y, which is the percentage change. So y dot will all of a sudden become delta y over y, or in terms of derivatives, dy dt divided by y. So you need to just to be aware of that when you read the remaining chapters in Snowden and Bain. I don't think they use this notation, have a reason to use this notation in chapter 2, but eventually it'll show up in chapter 3 and subsequent chapters. And so it's just like different words mean different things in different contexts. Different variables, different notation in different contexts. Lowercase y, by the way, in this chapter in Snowden and Bain was consistent with ManQ, which was real GDP, if it was real GDP divided by the labor force or population, which they were mainly considering to be close substitutes for each other. Basically, last time I covered most of the basics of economic growth. I do want to talk about the Harrod-Domar model, which, before I get to the Solow model, and give you a little bit of a simplified summary of that model. But before that, let's first give you some of my thoughts about ManQ Chapter 7. I know that Snowden and Bain were very dense, but I hope that reading ManQ made Snowden and Bain a little bit more intelligible, and in some respects, or in several respects, they complement each other. ManQ's Chapter 7, Economic Growth 1, is essentially a presentation of the Solow model. And the thing I like about this chapter is that it's one of the clearest expositions of the Solow model. Actually, the Solow-Swan model, because Swan was an Australian economist who independently came up with the same model, but most people just refer to it as the Solow model because they're prejudiced in favor of American economists. But in some respects, I found Chapter 7 somewhat offensive, because it's the one chapter where ManQ most clearly takes the perspective of a central planner. And I think I alluded to this last week, where he has a statist bias, because he's always talking about this rate of saving not as a personal choice, which in fact is the way economists should treat it, that is something that should be determined by the government. And I think there's no reason, I think there's a good reason to have government policies that don't discourage people from saving or inhibit them from saving, but on the other hand, to try to micromanage the saving rate, I think is not the role of government. Roger Garrison, who you'll be reading some chapters from when we get to Austrian business cycle theory, puts this very succinctly. He said macroeconomists should not adopt rapid growth as one of their goals any more than microeconomists should adopt plenty of vegetables as one of theirs. I've also already talked about how I felt that when he got to the population issue, by focusing on Michael Kremer's really impoverished view, or basically it's just a statistical exercise showing something that we all knew, which was an economic growth population group. and to, I don't think it has, I mean, it's mathematics masquerading as economics. I don't think there's much economic insight in that, in his approach. And that's why I had you read the article about Julian Simon, because his work actually, I think, is full of economic insights, making the case much more effectively about the value of population growth in encouraging economic growth. So, or at least contributing to economic growth. So, as you recall, I was going to have people do class presentations, 5 minutes, right? So I would like Sharika to take on the first half of the Snowden and Bain chapter and focus on what you think, what you got out of it, any questions you have, what you think was important in that chapter.
First half
up until he got through convergence. You're on.
Okay, so I got a lot out of the chapter, and I'll just go through each section and what I kind of got out, the main points of each section.
Good.
So obviously the introduction, economic growth is the most important determinant of living standards. That's pretty general. The Great Divergence. So international differences in the standard of living after the Industrial Revolution that is measured by real income per capita is the Great Divergence.
Right.
And we can measure this difference through 3 different ways. There's the gross national income, life expectancy, and the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is comprised of real income per capita, longevity, and education. So for 11.3, that was that we would need more emphasis on history, and that both economists that are focused on theory and economic historians can learn from one another, and that long-run growth research needs to look to the past in order to make more insights.
Yeah, that's right on as far as I'm concerned.
11.4. So this is when new classical models began replacing new Keynesian models, and then there was a resurgence of long-run research because of new research and tools. There was availability of new data, and then these are the 3 big ones. That there were a lot more that were mentioned. The third one is realization that some of the sub-Saharan African nations were not converging with the OECD nations. 11.5, why growth is important. So huge differences in living standards actually come from small differences in growth rates. So small differences in growth rates will actually have big consequences.
Right.
And I think they kind of broke that down by showing the rule of 70. 11.6. So one of the first things that was said was that sustained intensive economic growth was the biggest event that has happened in history, and that the difference between extensive and intensive growth is extensive. As the GDP rises, it's absorbed by population growth, versus intensive growth is beyond the population growth.
Right.
And so it leads to sustained increasing living standards. And there's a breakdown of the intensive growth, which is between Smithian and Promethean, with Promethean being driven by technological innovation.
Yeah, he makes the distinction in terms of what causes it, whereas I last time made the distinction in terms of the impact. Smithian growth only has a level effect, where Promethean growth has a sustained effect, which I think is a better way to think about it.
And then 11.7 was some stylized facts of growth. So a couple of them being output to worker growth continuously, the rate of return on capital is stable, shares of labor and capital remain stable, that there are significant variation across nations. Growth can be correlated to trade, and I think one that was mentioned twice essentially is that there's a variation of income per capita across countries, and that the growth will in the world as well as in countries vary. 11.8, the main thing that I got out of that is the difference between proximate and fundamental growth. So proximate is accumulation of factor inputs and variables that influence production, but it doesn't answer why certain countries grow or don't grow,
Right.
even if they have labor and capital. Fundamental is answering that question. So it's related to variables that may influence that growth, such as political, social, and influences, as well as geography, size of governments, etc. 11.9 to 11.10 is the Herod-Domar model as well as the Solow model. So those are kind of ones. So Herod-Domar kind of focuses on investment, increasing economic production. And there are some problems that were mentioned with that, which is that capital output ratio is fixed. So if the capital and labor don't grow equally, then they fall off the equilibrium. It's knife edge equilibrium.
Right, yeah.
And then the Solow model is that the steady state depends on population growth and technological progress.
Yeah, you don't need to talk about the Solow.
11.11 was about growth accounting, which is calculating the importance of capital, labor, and technology.
Right, and what's the variable they use as a proxy for technology? What's it referred to? There's a term for, in other words, we have, yeah, what kind of residual? Solow residual.
Oh.
Solow. It'll be coming up over and over again. So that's why I want to emphasize it. I'll talk a little bit about growth accounting and why it's not very reliable. And then can you say one or two words about convergence?
Right. So the Solow model has conditional convergence. And what I got out of that is growth rates are rapid during transitional times, but once steady state is achieved, the growth rate is equal to the rate of technological progress, and this kind of explains disparity between formations.
Okay, well, you did a really good job of getting the main points. Thank you. Let me make a couple of observations, and then I'll start talking about Herod-Domar. Obviously, The Great Divergence, this book was published in 2005, and one of the reasons I had you watch, which I hope you all did, the Hans Roslingberg video, is because The Great Divergence is tending to reverse, and especially with both India and China representing a huge part of the world's population, we're beginning to see what might be called the Great Convergence. Among the stylized facts. I would emphasize 4 of them. Well, actually 3 of them. One of them is obvious. One of them just defines what is sustained Promethean growth, and that's K1 on the page. All right. So K1 defines what we're trying to explain. K2, the capital labor ratio shows continuous growth. In other words, to put it in the terminology I had last week, countries that enjoy sustained growth enjoy also capital accumulation. You do not have sustained growth without ongoing capital accumulation, which means an increase in the capital stock per person. K3 is also interesting because it sort of it relates to the differences between these models and whether they're reliable or not. The rate of return on capital is fairly stable. In other words, although historically you have seen a small decline in interest rates since the beginning of economic growth, of real interest, you haven't seen dramatic changes in real interest rates over time, nor do you see dramatic changes in real interest rates between countries. You see marginal differences between countries. So the rate of return on capital is relatively stable. And then K5, this is one of the motivations for the Cobb-Douglas production function. The shares of labor and capital in GDP remain stable. What that is essentially saying is that if you divide GDP into income to labor in the form of wages and income to capital, it's fairly stable. Now, it seemed to be fairly stable, although there have been several challenges to that. The most recent challenge is in the work of Thomas Piketty on income inequality. And one of his major arguments is that income inequality is driven by an increase in the return to capital relative to the return to labor. But whether that's actually happened and when it's happened is still debated. The distinction between proximate and fundamental sources of economic growth is critical. And the way I would describe it is the proximate, talking about factors of production is one way of talking about the proximate factors, but all of the models that you've looked at, the Solow model, the Herrera-Domar model, endogenous growth theory, they're all looking at the proximate determinants. And everyone agrees that the fundamental determinants are institutions, governments, government policies, because of the huge divergence between GDP per capita and growth rates that occur right at the border. And that's one of the reasons why one of my reservations about the second Mankiw chapter on growth, because most of the recent literature, and there's been a huge explosion in this literature, has moved from the modeling to the fundamental factors. In other words, to economic history, which of course is my specialty. Mankiw says a little bit about that, but not very much. And I think that it deserves a lot more attention in a text. There are some good quotations in this section and in the next section that underscore the weaknesses in the Solow model, particularly Mankiw on page 604 Right? Remember that if you're being rigorous, and unlike Mankiw, Snowden and Bain point this out, that the Solow model is assuming that the economy only has one good, which is both the consumption good and the capital good. And if that's true, diminishing returns to capital obviously follows from that assumption. So then here Solow, at the end of this long quotation, admits, or in this long quotation, admits the production function should not be viewed literally as a description of specific production processes, but as a mapping from quantities of inputs into quantities of output. To say that different countries have the same production function is merely to say that they have had the same inputs, they would produce the same output. Different countries with different levels need not rely on exactly the same processes for producing goods and services. Okay, here's the critical. When a country doubles its capital stock, it does not give each worker twice as many shovels, right? It replaces shovels with bulldozers, which means to assume that the capital stock is in any sense homogeneous doesn't seem to be very consistent with reality, and yet he tries to make it consistent with his model. On page 609, in the middle paragraph, again talking about the Solow model, a model that predicts a constant steady state